Good evening, everyone. I'd like to welcome everyone to the Lawton Chiles Center for Florida History Lecture Series at Florida Southern College. I'm Tracy Tedder, and I have the privilege and the pleasure of serving as the Provost and Vice President for Academic Affairs. It is my great honor to welcome each of you to this special event as we kick off this year's lecture series. The Lawton Chiles Center for Florida History is a vital part of our campus as well as our community. It is dedicated to the study and the preservation of the unique history of our great state of Florida. It serves as a bridge connecting past, present, and future by fostering a deeper understanding of Florida's rich and diverse heritage. This lecture series exemplifies Florida Southern's commitment to academic inquiry, civic engagement, and intellectual dialogue. Through the efforts of the Lawton Chiles Center, we're able to bring esteemed historians, scholars, and leaders to our campus to share their expertise as well as their insights into Florida's history, a history that continues to shape and influence the nation in new and profound ways. I'd like to take a moment to recognize and express my great appreciation to Dr. Mike Denham and all of those who make this series possible. Dr. Denham is one of our esteemed faculty members at Florida Southern College who has dedicated so many years to supporting his students and helping them to make a positive and consequential impact on society. It is due to Dr. Denham's hard work that we can continue to offer these opportunities to both our students as well as our broader community. So again, thank you for joining us. We hope and we look forward to a wonderful lecture this evening as we kick off this year. I'd like to thank you for joining us and for all of your continued support of Florida Southern College. It is my pleasure, and I'd ask you to please join me in welcoming Dr. Mike Denham.
Thank you, Dr. Tedder. I really appreciate that introduction, and it really is an exciting night tonight for another opening of our series. My name's Mike Denham, and I'm delighted to be able to welcome you to kick off our 2024-25 series edition of the Florida Lecture Series produced by the Lawton Chiles Center for Florida History. And whether you've been with us from the very beginning, back in the 90s and early 2000s when we began, or whether this is your first time with us, welcome, and we're delighted you're with us. The series began in 1996 as a way to introduce students, faculty, and our community to Florida life, culture from a wide range of subjects, including history, literature, public affairs, environment, law, music, art, politics, public policy, women's studies, African American studies. In 2001, we established the center and we expanded the Lawton Chiles Center and expanded our charge of engaging Florida history and expanding the lecture series. Over the years, our speakers have included writers, public officials, and others who have explored Florida from a variety of viewpoints. And tonight's special guest continues that tradition. Before we welcome our distinguished speaker, I'd like to say a few things about this year's programs and some other things. Next month, on October 3rd, we'll welcome historian Kevin Kokomore, the author of La Florida, Catholics, Conquistadors, and Other American Origin Stories. Kokomore will explore the Spanish influence in early American history. In November, one of our own will be with us for a program on the Florida Everglades. FSC graduate Charlie Fanning earned his master's from Georgetown and recently earned his PhD from University of Maryland. He now teaches at the University of Florida and will join us on November 14th. I also want to recognize my colleague Keith Honeycutt, who I saw in the audience out there. Keith, can you be recognized? He'll join us. He'll join us on January 30th to discuss his recent book, The Storm, an Antebellum Tale of Key West, a long-lost, unpublished novel, and thought to be the first novel published by a woman in Florida. We will have some additional programs this year, and so stay tuned by logging onto our website. And if you're not on our mailing list, both the regular mailing list and the email list, you can sign up by seeing my secretary, Isabel Sear, in the lobby, and she has a sign-up sheet there. Over the years, we've been blessed with wonderful financial support from members of the community. I want to give a special thank you to all of those of you who've donated to our efforts this year and in years past. Donations like yours allow us to bring these programs to the general public free of charge. It's going to be another great year, beginning with tonight. Now it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's special guest. Corey Malcom has spent a lifetime exploring the undersea world of the Florida Keys. As an underwater archaeologist and historian, Corey has spent a lifetime exploring, studying, and documenting undersea bottoms, not only, of course, in the Keys, but in faraway places like Asia and other places. But in the 1980s, as a recent graduate student, he took a job in Key West where he worked with Mel Fisher and the Mel Fisher organization that, of course, discovered and excavated the Spanish galleon Atocha, bringing up hundreds and hundreds of thousands and really millions of dollars worth of treasure. And of course, it was one of those amazing events of the 1960s that occurred. After that, he went to work for the Mel Fisher Museum, and he continued his work with the museum, directing the underwater activities there for about 30 years. And then he took a job, of course, he became leader of the Florida Keys History Center. He's investigated and published on the shipwrecks of the 1622 galleon, the Atocha, of course, the 1700 English slaver, Henrietta Marie, the 16th century galleon, Santa Clara, and the Cuban pirate slaver, the Guerrero, among others. And again, he's going to talk about his work tonight with exploring the underwater slave ships. Malcom holds degrees from Indiana, Southeastern universities, and recently earned his PhD from the University of Huddersfield in England. He's president of the Key West Maritime Historical Society and is on the advisory council member of the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary. So, ladies and gentlemen, please help join me in welcoming Corey Malcom to our stage.
Thank you, Dr. Denham. It is a pleasure to be here at Florida Southern College. I've never been here. Beautiful place. You guys should be proud. It's a really wonderful campus. Lakeland is beautiful. I'm happy to be here. I'm going to speak to you tonight about slavery in the sea, exploring the transatlantic slave trade in the Florida Keys. But first, let me give you a little context as to who I am exactly. Dr. Denham gave you an overview, but I am the lead historian for the Florida Keys History Center. And we are a county office. We're part of the Monroe County Library System, sort of a branch within the library system. But our job is to explore, preserve, promote, and make accessible the history of Monroe County, Florida. That's a pretty large task, and we do it in a variety of ways. You can really access all of the things that we do from our website, keyslibraries.org/Florida History. We publish daily This Day in Keys History. I do a monthly research project and publish that through our website. So check those out. Our mission is what I said, but really it's people coming in and asking questions. So we help them find answers, and it's as simple as that. So I'm wearing that hat tonight, but as Dr. Denham alluded to, I worked for many years for the Mel Fisher Maritime Museum, and really the stories I'm going to be telling tonight happened under the purview of the museum. So I've got to be both people, a museum person and a Florida Keys History Center historian. But in the big picture, it is all Keys history, and I am happy and proud to be sharing it with you tonight. First, why the history of the history and archaeology of the transatlantic slave trade in the Florida Keys? I mean, what's special about the Florida Keys? Why is there so much evidence of the slave trade there? Well, look, Key West was not a slave trading center. People were enslaved in the Keys in the 19th century, absolutely. But there was not a large-scale agriculture there, no plantations, that sort of thing. People were generally in service, working in households. And really the biggest employer of enslaved labor in the Florida Keys was the U.S. government. And the Army Corps of Engineers rented enslaved people to build our big brick forts that we have down there, Fort Taylor and Fort Jefferson. But there were never slave ships coming into Key West, selling hundreds of people, as you might have seen in some historical illustrations and that sort of thing. The reason is geography, plain and simple. I don't have a pointer, but the Florida Keys are the little 150-mile-long chain of islands at the southern tip of Florida. It's thousands and thousands of small islands, as well as a reef that fronts those islands. And running between the Florida Keys and Cuba is the Gulf Stream current. And lots of ships from 1513 on up to today utilize that Gulf Stream current to catch an extra boost. They could get a 3-knot boost as they traveled from the Caribbean to the East Coast or to Europe by riding that. And so slave ships would ride that current so they could get back to their home ports in Europe. And the other big factor is the Florida Keys' proximity to Cuba. Cuba was one of the world's leading importers of enslaved people, and being close to that, a lot of ships wrecked or were otherwise intercepted heading into Cuba. So that's what makes the Keys special or somewhat unique as far as slave trading stories go. Now, of course, being the Keys, everything is related to the ocean somehow. These are all maritime stories, and some of these, I'm going to tell you, happen underwater even. There you go, the Florida Keys, slavery in the sea. But I also want to point out, and hopefully as we go through these, you'll see that all of these stories are good examples of how history and archaeology can intersect and how they can bring the past to light in especially powerful ways. I'm telling 3 stories tonight. Our first is the Henrietta Marie, a slave ship that sank in 1700, 35 miles west of Key West on a remote reef called New Ground Reef. The Henrietta Marie was a 120-ton London-based ship, and it was engaged in its second voyage as a slaver. It was about 100 feet long, just to give you a little perspective. The wreck was found in 1972 by Mel Fisher and his team from what was called Treasure Salvers Incorporated. They were looking for the wreck of a Spanish galleon, the Atocha, that had sunk somewhere out in that area back in 1622. So they were surveying all over the place, and they would find other wrecks. They came across this site, looked at it, recovered some material, kind of mapped out what they had found, and realized pretty quickly that, oh, okay, this is not a Spanish ship, and it is a little later than the period that we're looking for. And so they dubbed it the English wreck in the notes, and basically put it away and went on and continued their search for the Atocha. research picked up again about 10 years later. Some people thought, oh, it might be a pirate ship, so they were interested in pirates and wanted to look at that. In their work, quite fortunately, one day they went out in the summer of 1983, dropped the anchor, getting ready to set up the boat for a days of underwater work. Of course, sent a diver down to make sure the anchor was set, because you don't want it to drag and drift off the site. Lo and behold, right next to the anchor was a bell sitting there on the sea bottom. Well, the diver grabbed that bell. It weighs about 50 plus pounds, swam it up to the surface, and everybody just was excited because a bell can be a holy grail for a shipwreck. Here we have a ship, nobody knows its name, when it sank, anything. It's just the English wreck. Well, excitedly on deck, they picked off some of the coral incrustation from around the waist, and lo and behold, there it was, the Henrietta Marie, 1699. So now the English wreck had a name, it had a date, and with that information, that allowed research to happen in the English archives. And we learn in that historical research that the Henrietta Marie, of course, was based in London. It had made an earlier trip in 1697 and 98 to Barbados, where it had sold about 200 people in Barbados, and then returned to London, was refitted, cleaned up, and 8 London businessmen pooled their resources, put their investments into the ship for a second voyage. Now, the Henrietta Marie was sort of what you might dub a classic slave ship. It engaged in what was called the triangular trade, in which a three-legged voyage happened. The first involved carrying manufactured goods from Europe and England to the west coast of Africa. There on the African coast, they would trade those goods for people, and then they would leave through the second leg. If you've ever heard the term Middle Passage, this is what the Middle Passage was. This was where they would carry hundreds of people on their ships across the Atlantic Ocean to the American colonies. Now, we know the Henrietta Marie acquired somewhere around 220 people or so, and then left and sailed to Jamaica. First, let me show you where they traded. This was a map from the area. Again, I wish I had a pointer, but they're at the right side of the screen in a place called New Calabar, and that is in Nigeria today. But that's where the Henrietta Marie acquired their people. They went from there to Port Royal, Jamaica, and we know from the port records there that they sold 191 African people to the plantation owners in Jamaica. Now, you'll notice they left with over 200. What happened? Well, it was a given in the transatlantic slave trade that on average 20% of the human cargo would perish. That's why the diminished number. After they had sold everybody and made their a second profit, they bought with that money a cargo of sugar, ginger, tropical logwood, and then they headed out to return to London with their third cargo. The ship simply vanished. Nobody knew what happened to it, and it wasn't until November of 1700 that we see people in England realize, okay, this ship is never coming home, and they started settling the estates of some of the men who were on board. The wreck occurred in June, from everything we can gather. We don't know why it happened. It was probably a storm, but there's nothing to tell us exactly. But anyway, Henrietta Marie lost, and it wasn't found until almost 300 years later in that 1972 discovery. Now, since then, there have been multiple efforts out underwater to explore this shipwreck, conduct excavations, recover items, and a tremendous amount of knowledge has been gained through all of that field work. And they really illustrate the Henrietta Marie's operations. First and foremost, we see a lot of trade goods on the ship, items that were intended to be traded for people on the West African coast. These are some of the things that they didn't get rid of, but they were carrying them back to London for, I suppose, a third voyage if they could organize one. But you see things like iron bars in the upper left, pewter bottles, pewter tankards, lead mirror frames, pewter spoons, and glass beads. Just to give you a bit of economic context, those iron bars up in the upper left, those are about a foot long. 12 of those would buy one person in 1699. We found a lot of these. Those are shackles, iron shackles. Now, in total, 82 sets of iron shackles have been found on the site. And the way they worked is you see these U-shaped loops. Each loop was designed to hold one person's ankle, and then the other loop would hold another person's ankle. And then a bar would slide through the eyes at the end of those loops, and a wedge would be driven through a slot at the end of that bar and bent over. And then those people would be locked together 2 by 2 by their ankles and perhaps by their wrists. And you can see in the illustration, if you look at the ankles, you can see their legs are bound 2 by 2. So this kept people from rising up against the crew, and it kept them from wanting to jump overboard and try to swim away. So we have 82 sets. That's enough for 164 people. There are probably more on the sea floor that simply either deteriorated or just have not yet been found. Other evidence of the middle passage from the Henrietta Marie, you see a drawing of a big copper boiler. That's about 2.5 feet square. That was used to feed the African people on the Henrietta Marie, and they would boil up once a day things like yams or rice and beans, and then people would get a ladleful once a day. You see on the upper right, crude medical care. That is a tooth extractor. So if people had dental problems, they just simply pull the tooth. And then blunderbusses on the lower right there. Those were used, so they would generally let people out once a day from the hold of the ship up onto the deck to get air to move around. It kept people somewhat healthier by allowing them to do that, but they would only be allowed up on deck under armed guard. So the crew would have these blunderbusses, and if the African captives tried to rise up against the crew, then those could be put into use. So certainly evidence of the middle passage found on the Henrietta Marie. And we see as well out on the seafloor the hull of the ship. This was uncovered during one of our underwater efforts, documented and then reburied. But the dimensions that we were able to record from it are how we were able to calculate the size and the design of the ship. The Henrietta Marie was the first slave ship to ever be discovered, and combined with its cargo, it is the most complete example yet known. The Henrietta Marie has been absolutely crucial to understanding the material aspects and the physical realities of the transatlantic slave trade. And we have been pretty active in sharing that and putting it out on tour and getting it before people. And after a group called the National Association of Black Scuba Divers saw the Henrietta Marie and its contents, they were so moved that in 1993, they designed and then placed a 1-ton concrete monument at the site of the wreck with this plaque mounted into the face of it. Now, it went down as a bare monument, but you see in this photograph taken about 10 years after it went down, it's now become a living reef itself. Corals and sponges and sea fans have attached to it and make their home there now, but the plaque sticks out and it's still legible. So it's a remote and difficult to access memorial, but it is quite touching when you see it. I'm going to shift gears to our second story. This is at the other end of the Florida Keys, off Key Largo, about 20 miles south of Miami. And this is a story of really two ships, the Guerrero and another ship called the Nimble. And it also reflects a shift in the transatlantic slave trade. The Henrietta Marie was a legal business, and respected London businessmen invested in these ships, and they made money, and nobody thought twice about it. This happened in 1827. By then, the transatlantic slave trade is illegal. England had outlawed it in 1807, the United States in 1808, Spain in 1820, and if anybody after those years was operating, they were doing it illegally, and we'll see that in the story of Guerrero. Guerrero was a Cuban pirate slaver wrecked in 1827 while being chased by the British Royal Navy schooner Nimble. Guerrero was carrying 561 captive African people. Guerrero was originally the U.S. privateer James Monroe, and it had been built in Connecticut in 1813. Somehow, in the 1820s, and we don't know how or when or why the transition occurred, but the ship wound up in Cuba and was under the control of a Cuban pirate named Jose Gomez. And Gomez operated the ship. He called it first the Pepe, then he called it the San Jose, then in its last incarnation he called it the Guerrero. Probably all the name changes to try to stay ahead of the law. Gomez had a crew of 90 pirates, and they would sail this ship from Cuba across the Atlantic to Africa, plundering ships all the way. We have accounts of them on the west coast of Africa, robbing ships, just in classic pirate fashion, holding cutlass swords to the victims' throats, stealing everything except the clothes they were wearing. These were bad guys, out and out. And they also, somehow, in ways that we don't fully understand, acquired people along the African coast with the intent of selling them in Cuba. And Gomez and his crew had completed a voyage successfully in 1826, and in 1827, they were in their second voyage. On December 19th, 1827, Guerrero was sighted near the Bahamas by the British Navy schooner Nimble. And Nimble was stationed in the Bahamas very specifically to intercept illegal slave ships. Britain was the leading maritime entity in trying to suppress the transatlantic slave trade. And so they would have ships stationed in these sort of choke points, like the Bahamas, where ships were going into Cuba. It was a natural place to catch illegal slavers. They saw Guerrero and thought something looked suspicious. And so they tried to get Guerrero to stop so they could take a look. Well, Gomez was not going to stop. He took off. Nimble gave chase. They got into a gun battle, and they headed westward toward Florida. And as they crossed, night fell, and at 7:30 p.m., Guerrero slammed into the Florida Reef, and just 5 minutes later, Nimble struck the reef as well. Guerrero was a total loss. Its bottom was torn out. It rolled over on its side. 41 African people drowned right then when that happened. The Nimble was sitting on the reef not too far away. They threw over iron ballast blocks that they had down in the hold of the ship. They threw over cannonballs, trying to make the ship lighter so it would float and they could get off the reef. Well, it worked. They got off the reef. Once they were off, they set their anchor. Well, not too long after, their anchor line broke. They drifted backwards and went onto the reef again. In the morning, wreckers. Now, wreckers were people who were in the Florida Keys, and their sole business was to offer assistance to wrecked ships. They would rescue the people, they would rescue the cargoes, and hopefully rescue the ships too, and then they would be rewarded financially for that. So wreckers were stationed up there. When the sun came up, they saw these two ships sitting on the reef. They went out. They towed Nimble to safety, got it off the reef, got it anchored up safely, and then dealt with Guerrero. They got all the people off Guerrero, all the pirates. They got all the surviving Africans off and put them onto 3 wrecking vessels. Well, that evening, the pirates rose up against their rescuers, and they hijacked 2 of the wrecking vessels, got away to Cuba successfully with 400 of the African people. The Nimble eventually made it to Key West a few days later with 121 of the Africans. Those people were delivered to the U.S. Marshal in Key West. They stayed there for a couple of months, and then they were transferred to a plantation in Amelia Island off Jacksonville. And they lived there for almost 3 years, working essentially as enslaved people until the government figured out to send them to Liberia. And so the government leased a ship, sailed them to Liberia. Liberia is a colony or a country on the west coast of Africa, and it was designed specifically to take in freed American slaves and also people rescued from slave ships. So Liberia was the answer for the Guerrero survivors. Now, the story was big news back in 1827, 1828. Very well documented. We know all the different things that happened. For us, our interest was, where did it happen? And could any of the evidence of these ships still survive on the sea floor? Well, virtually everything said it happened at Carey's Fort Reef, which is a huge reef today, and we really, that would be like looking for a needle in a haystack. So we went through every document we could find, looking for evidence as to where this could have happened, and the best location that we had came with this. Now, this is an excerpt from the log of the British Navy schooner Nimble, written by Lieutenant Edward Holland. He wrote this on December 20th, the morning after they had been towed off the reef and they were anchored safely. And he wrote in his log, it says, "Slipped the BB cable, the best bower cable, their main anchor, came to in 2.5 fathoms, 15 feet of water, Carey's Fort light vessel, south by west, 1/2 west, and Black Sarah's Creek, north, 1/2 east." That's great. We got big problems, though. There's no Carey's Fort light vessel, and there's no Black Sarah's Creek. So he's using arcane terms, and we had to figure out what those meant. So again, into the history books and the documents, and we figured out that Black Sarah's Creek is today called Caesar's Creek, and we figured that the Carey's Fort light vessel was the lightship Caesar, and we could figure out where that was located. Once we had those 2 points, we could reverse Lieutenant Holland's bearings, and where those intersected would be where the Nimble was sitting the morning after these tragic events had occurred. That gave us an X, and then using things like weather accounts and sailing directions, we were able to figure out 3 likely spots where these wrecks occurred. And so, with that, It became a matter of outlining things. We set likely spots, and we created survey boundaries in waters shallower than 20 feet. We figured if it was deeper than 20 feet, they weren't going to hit that. So we looked only at shallower than 20 feet. We came up with this design for our surveys. We used small draft rigid hull inflatable boats, and the devices hanging off the bow of our boat are magnetometers. And those are devices that measure the Earth's magnetic field. And they're a great way to find old shipwrecks because iron will distort the Earth's magnetic field, and there's a lot of iron on these old wrecks. And so we suspended them over the water, didn't want to tow them through and snag them on coral, and then we surveyed back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, east-west lines, spaced 10 meters apart, collecting magnetic data over 3 summers. Hot, tiring, boring, sun-burning work, but we did it, and it was really the only way we could begin to figure out where these wrecks were, and we got great results. Through our work, we identified over 80 magnetic anomalies. 3 of those 80 turned out to be something pretty darn interesting. One was a shipwreck, and you see the magnetic signal at the top, but it was a shipwreck, just a debris field underwater of artifacts that all seemed to originate from one event. We put together multiple underwater exploration efforts. We worked over a period of about 15 years, going out, looking, mapping, documenting, and just trying to identify as much information on the sea floor as we could to see if this site might be the Guerrero. And some of the things we found. These are ballast stones. These are rocks. What's exciting about rocks? Well, in the Florida Keys, the only natural rock is limestone or coral rubble. All right? If it's not either of those, it came from the outside. Well, these rocks that we see on the sea floor here are not limestone and they're not coral rubble, so they came from somewhere else, and that somewhere else is almost certainly a shipwreck. Sailing ships had to carry ballast, tons and tons of ballast in the lower part of the hold. It acts as a counterweight to the sails because if you don't have ballast in your ship and your sails fill with wind, your ship's just going to flip over. If you have the counterweight, when the sails fill with wind, you don't flip over, you just propel forward. All right, so ballast is important, and it's an important clue for us. So we start seeing all these rocks underwater, and we say, okay, this is from a shipwreck. Here's some iron ballast. So they had mixed on this ship, iron ballast blocks as well as stone ballast. And then you see in the upper left, iron pins that helped hold the hull together. Copper spikes to nail the planks onto the hull. Lots and lots of those at this wreck site. Copper sheeting. This was large plates of copper, thin copper sheeting, tacked to the bottom of the hull. And that was used by some ships to keep shipworms away. Shipworms are mollusks that will bore into a ship's hull and turn it into Swiss cheese, and it won't float anymore. So copper sheeting helps keep the shipworms away. Lots of tacks for sheeting. This is important because we know Guerrero was sheathed with copper. Some wood. This is the only wood we found from the ship. It's really as big as my hand and forearm together. Not very much. We sampled it. We found out that it is white oak from the northern hemisphere. So good. That fits. It wasn't built in South America, so that fits with our Connecticut construction. Musket balls, again, important because Guerrero carried muskets, so we would expect to see these sorts of things on the site. And then we have these. These are a couple of these on the site you see on the right spinning around. It's called a palanqueta, and it is a type of iron bar shot that was really just a big wrought iron bar with flared ends, fired out of a cannon, was intended to whirl around, and it would do more destruction than just a simple cannonball, all right? Well, what's important about these palanquetas that we found is they're generally Spanish, all right? So fits, again, with Guerrero. We do have cannonballs on the site, too. 12-pound cannonballs. Again, a big clue because Guerrero carried 14 brass cannons, and they were all 12-pounders. They all shot 12-pound cannonballs, and that's what we see on the site, so it matches perfectly. Now, the cannons themselves were recovered in 1827 by the wreckers, who then sold them in Key West. So we don't expect cannons on the wreck, but the cannon shot matches. And then sort of weird day-to-day things, lots of these types of things on the site. You see there in my hand, I thought, oh, an inkwell. Wow, you know, that's really kind of neat, a 200-year-old inkwell. Well, it was pewter. I could see that pretty obviously. So we got back from the field, and I started digging around to learn about pewter inkwells, and I found out they didn't make pewter inkwells. They just didn't exist. So we had to go back and more research, and I finally found out that it is the end cap for a device called a clyster pump. Now, if you don't know what a clyster pump is, its other name is enema syringe. So this was I don't know, maybe we had some constipated pirates on this ship. Glass. We found a lot of glass. And as I'm kind of going through this, I hope you guys can see how little clues that seem so inconsequential and are generally not exciting artifacts can hold a lot of information, all right? Glass, broken bottleneck. Well, you know what? The mouths of bottles have changed through time, and those are pretty well documented, those changes. And so we find a wine bottleneck, and we can compare that to other examples that have been found, and we see that this style that we found has been known to occur between 1819 and 1840. Perfect. Here's another piece of glass. This is from a drinking vessel called a rummer. This is an English type of glass, but late 1700s, early 1800s, so it fits. Another neck. This is from an eau de cologne bottle, very small, delicate, thin glass bottle. But you see on the right an example from 1811 is almost a perfect match. And then this big bottleneck on the left, it comes from what was called a demijohn. And a demijohn was a big, huge glass bottle that was used to carry liquor. Now, these are kind of hard to date. This thing's sort of generic to the 1700s, 1800s, but it certainly evokes that idea of pirates and rum and that sort of thing. And then this has been crucial. This is just a broken piece from a plate. But it's a style that is quite telling. Now, this is called blue edge pearlware. All right, now it's an English type of pottery, but it has on it embossed, well, it has sort of an undulating edge, all right, a scalloped edge, and then it has embossed in it sprigs of wheat and daisies. Well, this stuff is very highly collectible, and there are lots of obsessive pearlware collectors out there, and they've documented when all these patterns happen and all that. This particular pattern that we see on this shipwreck site happened, its peak use was in the 1820s. Perfect. We mapped the site a couple of times, but you can see it's just sort of a scattered debris field. There's not a ship sitting down there by any stretch of the imagination. It's in water from 6 feet to 12 feet, very, very shallow. It's a dynamic area. The edge of the reef is along the eastern side, and big waves break over it at times, and they've knocked everything around. And so there's no ship there. There's just material from a ship. And it's scattered over about a 250 by 300 foot area. So what does all this evidence tell us? Well, it's a wreck of a sailing ship. We see that. We find rigging and that sort of stuff at the site. The artifacts, as a group, all put this ship into the early part of the 1800s. The ship was a total loss. There's too many things that would have been essential to it. It could not have floated again. And we see things like copper sheeting, important. Guerrero had copper sheeting, 12-pound cannonballs, but no cannons. That's exactly the scenario we would expect for Guerrero. No anchors. Guerrero's anchors were salvaged by the wreckers and sold. Musket shot, again, Guerrero carried muskets. And we have kind of a mix of cultures. We have English things, we have Spanish things, and think about it. That kind of would fit for the idea of a pirate ship, because pirates, what are they doing? They're going out and they're just stealing from anybody, all right? They might steal from an American ship, a British ship, a Spanish ship, a French ship, and they're going to wind up on board that pirate ship with a whole bunch of mishmash of different stuff. And that might be hints of what we're seeing here. I don't know. But anyway, unfortunately, we have nothing directly attributable to Guerrero. We have no human remains that we could extract African DNA from. We have no anything that says Jose Gomez. We have nothing that says Pepe, San Jose, or Guerrero on it. So the evidence is all circumstantial. We do know there's more wreckage there on the site. We can, with our metal detectors, know. I didn't say it, but this site is on a very, one of the most pristine reefs in the Florida Keys. So we have never been granted permission by the state of Florida or the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary to do any sort of digging because the reef kind of trumps history in this case. But that's okay. We've got a lot of material to work with. So, another site in our survey was an anchor, very near, about 1/3 of a mile away. And when we looked at it and measured it, we know Nimble lost an anchor in that area. This fits perfectly. It's the right size, it's the right design, it's the right era for the type of anchor that a British Navy schooner would have carried at that time. So again, it doesn't say Nimble on it, but boy, it sure fits everything we know. And then, not far from that anchor, on top of another reef, what do we find? Iron ballast blocks and iron cannonballs, exactly as Nimble described, throwing overboard to lighten the ship so they could float free of that reef. And this, this could not be anything else but where Nimble ran aground. So you see on the right, the iron ballast blocks are about 3 feet long, weigh about 350 pounds, and then a whole slew of iron cannonballs just scattered across the reef. We again mapped all that out and have a good sense of it, but it's again right on top of a shallow reef, not far from the other shipwreck site. So where are we with this project? Well, we have surveyed 3 areas. 2 of them, we found nothing related to the 1827 events. And the other site, other reef, we found 3 sites that all fit exceptionally well. We do have a slight wild card. There is a 3rd area, or a 4th area, I guess, to the north. That is in Biscayne National Park. We have not been authorized to do any survey work in there. The National Park team, they have their own efforts going. So we're kind of waiting for them to wrap up their research, but I'm certain, honestly, that we have located the Guerrero and the Nimble. So there's much more work to come. Stay tuned. Now, last story. We're going to switch gears to 1860 and go to Key West. And this is what we call the African Cemetery, or it's also known as a story of the last slave ships. This is related, well, really starts in the late 1850s. The Cuban sugar industry in the late 1850s was absolutely booming. Cuba was the world's largest producer of sugar. They produced 1/3 of the world's sugar supply at that time. And the whole business was based on enslaved labor. And they would always need more and more and more people to work in these plantations, sugar plantations. Now, it was all illegal, but the Cuban government was kind of turning a blind eye because everybody was making so much money. Now, in the late 1850s, there was also a glut of U.S. ships. A lot of people had built ships hoping to cash in on the California craze. You know, there'd been the gold rush in 1849. Unfortunately, there was an economic downturn. A lot of these ships just wound up kind of sitting at the dock. So in the late 1850s, a lot of U.S. ship owners are going, man, what am I going to do with my ship? Well, if I go to West Africa, get people, and sell them in Cuba, I can make a fortune. And they really could. Some of these voyages, they made $500,000. Imagine that, in $1860. So the incentive was strong to go rogue and go to Africa and get people. And it got so bad that in the November of 1859, President Buchanan ordered a blockade of Cuba by the U.S. Navy. And he said, we got to stop this. It's out of control. And so they put 2 U.S. Navy ships on the south side of Cuba, 2 on the north side of Cuba, and those ships just patrolled along looking for illegal U.S.-owned slave ships. Well, in the spring of 1860, they had great luck. They intercepted 3 ships and brought them where? To Key West. They intercepted the ships Wildfire, William, and Bogota. They brought them to Key West, as I said, and on board those 3 ships was a total of 1,432 African people. These refugees were delivered to the U.S. Marshal at Key West. These images are both of those ships in Key West. On the left, you see the ship Wildfire with the African people on board on deck. And on the right, you see the ship William and cartloads of people being carried off that ship. You've got to understand one thing. These people were mostly teenagers between the ages of, say, 14 and 18. They were young. And it's really, I mean, their whole story is just a tragic case. Anyway, housing was built for them very quickly on the southwestern corner of Key West, a 3-acre compound fenced in, and it had barracks, it had a kitchen, and it had a hospital. And these people then were taken from the ships, put into this compound, and basically they waited. They lived there for 2.5 months until a decision was made about what to do with them. Here you see another view of the compound and some of the people that were living there. These were published in national newspapers of the day. So the decision was very similar to Guerrero. The U.S. government said, okay, let's send these people to Liberia. And they chartered 3 ships from New York City. Those ships came down to Key West, and they carried them to Liberia. Now, sadly, we have the numbers for all their various voyages, the numbers of people that left Africa initially, and the numbers of people that were delivered to the Liberian coast all those months later. It was only 40% of the people survived the entire voyage. From the 2 crossings of the Atlantic and their time in Key West, 60% of those people died. Those kids, all for nothing, really. In Key West, we see the evidence of death. We have receipts that were delivered to the U.S. Marshal by a man who built coffins for them and buried these people. 295 people died in Key West during their time there. We have not just the receipts, but other evidence of this event. Here you see on the right a map from 1861, and on the southern shore of Key West is a notation, African Cemetery, with X's drawn in it, almost certainly that of those 295 people. So, we, again, the sad part is, these people were buried. The Civil War broke out very shortly after they were buried. A fort was built over the top of most of these graves, and the cemetery was largely forgotten. It really, very few people knew it existed. But its memory did persist in historical circles, and, for me, I began to think, my gosh, could this thing still exist? Could this cemetery be there still? And we just don't know it. And so it became a matter, again, of using the historical record. The most obvious way was to, this was in the early days of Photoshop, but I learned pretty quickly to overlay the old map with a modern aerial image, and the map was drawn beautifully by the Army Corps of Engineers, so it fit exactly, used the same lines that we use today. And you could see exactly where the African cemetery was in relation to modern Key West. And it was most of it underneath this fort, but a lot of sticking out to the side of the beach. So we decided to search, and we used a device called a ground-penetrating radar system. And this, you can see in the photo, looks kind of like a lawnmower with no wheels, a boxy lawnmower with no wheels. And you simply drag it along the ground. It shoots radar energy into the ground. That energy reflects back. Those reflections are collected by an antenna. That signal then goes into the computer where you can process it. And then you see, essentially, as you pass over an area, a slice. Think of like a slice of bread. One slice doesn't tell you a whole lot, but when you line them up side by side, you can see the whole loaf. So when you take all this GPR data and line it up side by side, you get a pretty clear image. And in this first effort, we found 15 graves exactly where they should have been. Now, it was a little perplexing because we put together a good effort, found graves, but you know what? We only had 15 graves, and we know 295 people died. Where were they? So we started a couple years later another bigger search in a greater area around that beach, and again, tremendous success and even more graves. And we wound up finding dozens and dozens and dozens, if not hundreds of graves there. Somewhat inland from the beach, and when you put them all together, everywhere you see a red dot is where we found at least one grave. All right, so there's many, many graves there in what is a public county park. So this is now recognized as the African Cemetery. It has been placed on the National Register of Historic Places as nationally significant. There is more to do. There was a monument built over those initial graves that we found. This is a memorial to those people buried there. We have a state historical marker right adjacent to it. And this site has really become an important part of Key West now. It is where we have twice a year now memorial remembrance services for those people buried there, and then our Juneteenth celebrations happen there as well on that beach. So it is really a big part of the Key West cultural identity now. So it's nice because for so long, 150 years, these people were forgotten. Now they're not. They are a part of the community once again. Now, the Mel Fisher Maritime Museum is working on displays. These are some displays that are up and running, but they're going to open a new exhibit in about 2 weeks down there. So it's called Spirits of the Passage, and it tells every story I just told you here tonight. If you make it down to Key West, go there. You can see the things that we brought up from the sea floor. You can learn much, much more than I'm telling you. And you can also see things from the Spanish galleons as well. We do what we can to tell these stories. It can get on TV, that's great. I write research papers and get them out there. I put everything on the web. You know, we do things like what I'm doing here today. Talk, share, and let people know. So it's important that people know about the transatlantic slave trade. And combined archaeological and historical research from the Florida Keys gives particularly vivid insight into how it functioned and how it evolved through time, whether operating as a legitimate business or under the purview of pirates, or found in the plight of hundreds of refugees. The transatlantic slave trade was one of history's great agents of social change, and it was a system that shaped our world, and its legacies still resonate today. Thank you. That's it. I'll be happy to take any questions you might have.
I'm hoping, oh, there we go, it's on. The microphone is working, and I think we have some time for questions. The Guerrero story was written up in Esquire magazine. I discovered that, and of course you were featured in that magazine, and it was quite an interesting story. And this is one of the most significant stories in American history, as far as, and also global history. It's a global history, and it's an important history that we understand. Any questions? We have some time for questions.
I may have misheard you, but did you say early on that the United States had outlawed slavery in 1808?
No, that was slave trade.
Outlawed the importation?
Yes, you couldn't
Okay.
convert people from one country to another or into the United States on ships.
Okay.
So it was illegal. Now listen, slavery was not illegal. The slave trade, bringing people on ships, was illegal. So those people that were already enslaved, that was their fate. Yeah.
And that was actually put in the Constitution. It was ratified in 1788. It stated that within 20 years that trade would be over. But of course it took Congress to pass that law into action in 1808. So, but that did not mean that, well, there was a tremendous market, so the slaves are still going to, it's a very profitable enterprise, like drugs or any other contraband that would come in. So, yeah.
Yep.
How deep was the Henrietta when it sank, or how deep was, what depth was it at?
I'm sorry, I'm having a hard time understanding it.
What was the approximate depth of the Henry Marie? In other words, how far did you have to go down?
The Henrietta Marie is in water ranging from 25 feet to about 8 feet, and it's right along the edge of a reef. Judging from what we've seen from the site and the distribution, it probably got caught in some sort of tropical storm and was just smashed onto the reef and torn up.
Could you tell us exactly what we're looking at in the photograph that's behind you?
At the bottom, that is the hull of the Henrietta Marie, and you are looking at the framing of the ship. So those are the ribs, I guess, would be in common terms. And then underneath, if you can see some of the planking from the hull. And what was left of the ship was really the extreme lower back end of the ship, the aft stern. And that was it. It really was just about 6 or 8% of the ship survived. But it was enough that we can use the information to calculate it out and figure the size. So
there was a time when the Secretary of State of the state of Florida and the archives of the state of Florida was very interested in the history of the state of Florida. Is any interest being shown presently?
Yeah, I think absolutely. You know, I've certainly talked to plenty of people at the state about this, and I think you will see with the Guerrero in particular, it is within the boundaries of John Pennekamp Coral Reef State Park. So ultimately, it's going to be under state purview. So I hope that you know, the state archaeologists will be wanting to tell more about this site. There is an exhibit in the Pennekamp State Park Welcome Center about this, so you know, it's a start. But yes, and they've had an interest in the Henrietta Marie. It was actually in Tallahassee about a year and a half ago. Was up there for a few months before right before the museum. Yeah, right before the museum got closed down for renovations. It was up there.
One of the neat things about tonight is I get to share some of my students with the audience, and one of my best students here is Mr. Cutler. I don't want to make you nervous, but anyway, here he is.
Oh, no pressure at all, Professor Denham. Thank you. You mentioned that after these enslaved individuals were rescued, they were eventually sent to Liberia.
Right.
I would ask, what happened to them after that? Did they stay in Liberia, or did they attempt to seek out where they were originally from?
From the Guerrero, those people were sent to a town called New Georgia, and they generally stayed there because they do show up in a census was taken in, I think, 1845 in Liberia, and they show up in the census living in and around New Georgia. With the Key West people that were sent there in 1860, we really don't know. They were sent to 3 different places, and we have no record of their names, so there's no way to really trace what they did afterwards. So, yeah, it's a sad tale, and that's one of the things about this whole transatlantic slave trade is it tended to wipe out people's identities, and so searching historically is really, really tough. It's a challenge. Yeah, would they not try to get to their original homes? You would think, but you know, you got to remember the African continent is huge, and so if they came from the Congo River region, you know, that's 1,500 miles away. So it may not have been possible. Yeah.
My question, in all of the records that you have between the Henrietta and the Guerrero,
yeah,
was there any records of the names of all of those slaves?
No.
None whatsoever?
None.
Or the locations from where
the
they
only,
were?
The only people that there are names for are the ones from the Guerrero who were delivered to Key West and then were eventually sent to Liberia. The other, we know 400 people were taken by the pirates to Cuba. We have no idea who they were.
So
only those
so not even from the place of origin?
No. We know generally they came from it's hard to describe on the West African coast, but yeah, we do know the general region they came from, but the Guerrero people seem to have stayed in Liberia.
And of course, we have to remember that these wrecks were just a tiny, tiny sliver of the activity and the action of these slave ships coming across over the centuries.
Yeah, let me just tell you the
speak
numbers,
to that a little bit.
Because you know, this system ran for over 350 years, and 12 million people were shipped across the ocean in 36,000 voyages. That gives you the scale. I mean, it's phenomenal. When I said it, that it's one of the huge social change events that drove social change, with those numbers, my goodness, it couldn't be anything but that. So it's staggering. It's staggering. And remember, those 36,000 voyages are the ones that there's a record for. Those are ones that somebody has gone through and found a document, an entry. There are others that were just sort of like pirate ships that went and they flew under the radar. So it's a staggering number.
Just wondering, is the location public for the Henrietta Marie? Is it open to recreational divers?
Yeah, there's really nothing there. The hull is there. It's buried under the sand, so you can't see it. The monument is there, and we do the numbers for the monument are public. The problem with the Henrietta Marie is that it's so far out there, and it's really not a very friendly place out there. It gets kind of rough, and the currents are strong. There are a few charter boats that will go out there. But if somebody wants to do it, absolutely, and I'll get a hold of me. I'll give you the numbers.
I just was going to ask, were there mixed genders on these ships?
Yes, absolutely, men and women. They would tend to carry more men, but absolutely, women were a part of it.
Thank you so much for the presentation tonight. I couldn't help but think as I listened to the many references regarding the slave trade and times when it was deemed to be illegal, and thought every place where I hear the word illegal, I replace it with the word immoral.
Oh, yeah.
So an unjust law, immoral, and all of the conversation that flows from immorality is tragic in the consistent unfolding. So the people whose names and identities were lost in the transatlantic slave trade, this portion that you have highlighted tonight,
yep.
Millions of names and identities were lost for people who survived the Middle Passage,
yep.
or were born in the Americas, and still their treatment, the horrific conditions under which they lived, has caused such a breach in the histories that Black people are able to tell of their own families in this country.
Nope,
and
absolutely.
I find myself wondering, so here's the question, given your considerable work and study, how and what would you recommend in terms of really highlighting this story and amplifying it in a culture that largely does not want these stories to be told? Because in Florida, those are, related to stories that really don't have support in being told, and you have to keep those stories alive within your families to the extent that you know them. But there really isn't a large public discourse to share those stories.
Right. I think in the work that you're seeing here, and one of the reasons that it is especially effective and especially powerful is that it's real, it's tangible. It's not somebody telling a story. You can see those shackles, and you can see how they worked, and you can feel the horror when you see those things. And it just makes all of this an undeniable reality. And I think that's really one of the most powerful parts of all of it, is it just is tangible. And whoever wants to try to say, oh, it didn't happen that way, no. We have the things that tell us it did happen this way, and you can't deny that. And
Okay.
that's really it.
I have the last question. This will be the last question. No, I just wanted you to reflect a little bit on your work with the African American scuba folks.
Yeah.
Because I remember reading the article in Esquire magazine that featured the story of, tell us about that organization, and also tell us about your feelings about what it was like to work with them.
Oh, yeah. Well, really, that relationship started when they had heard about the Henrietta Marie, this group called the National Association of Black Scuba Divers, and my colleagues and I went to they had an annual summit, and so we went to their annual summit in Fort Lauderdale. A few hundred people there, talked about the Henrietta Marie, brought some artifacts, showed them. They were so moved that they decided they wanted to create this monument. So we worked with them on the best design, what would work underwater, how to place it on the site, and that really just kind of kept growing, because now the NABS for short was really interested in learning more and being more involved in uncovering some of these stories. And as time went on, a sort of a subgroup called Diving with a Purpose was formed, and its focus is really to go out and try to locate and try to bring awareness to these stories and others, and get kids involved in it. And so they have a very active youth program. NABS formed, I get this a lot from people. They say, why do we need a Black Scuba Divers Association? Why can't they just be a Scuba Divers Association? Well, you got to remember, this group formed when they could not dive with white people legally. And so they had to have their own association, their own group. And it's just carried on, all right? And so it has, it's not a divisive group. If you're white, you can join. And they have also now, through DWP, began to get younger people involved, teenagers. And, diving has not always been accessible to the black community. It can be an expensive sport, and it's just not a traditionally, a traditional activity for a lot of black families. So they have very purposefully reached out and gotten the youth involved, and it's really, really a neat program. So they're out teaching kids to dive first, and then getting them to learn underwater mapping techniques and that sort of thing, and then going out into the ocean, which would have been unthinkable for some of these kids, and here they are a couple of years later. They're actually out under the ocean mapping out a shipwreck. So it's pretty powerful stuff. And they've been going now for about 20 years. And you'll be hearing more from them. So we have worked together on the Guerrero project, on the Henrietta Marie, and I'm sure there will be others.
Well, thank you, Corey. We appreciate your program, and I'm sure you'll hang around a little bit and maybe answer some questions.
Absolutely.
Thank you for coming and being with us, and we'll see you again on October 3rd. So right in this room, October 3rd.